What drives a man to the darkest edge of violence? And what does justice look like when the crime shakes an entire state? In Alabama, James Osgood's name is now etched into the history of death row. Convicted of a brutal, unimaginable crime, his execution is now just days away. But behind the headline is a web of pain, controversy, and a system under scrutiny. This is the story of James Osgood, the woman he killed, and the state preparing to end his life.
Today, Governor Ivey is setting the next execution on Alabama's schedule. The window opens at midnight on April 24th for James Osgood.
The crime that led to Osgood's death sentence wasn't just horrific, it was haunting. In 2010, in Chilton County, Alabama, James Osgood and his girlfriend turned on a woman named Tracy Brown. According to authorities, they beat her, sexually abused her, and then mutilated her body in an act that shocked even seasoned investigators. The brutality of the crime and the apparent premeditation made the case stand out in Alabama's courts. Prosecutors pushed for the ultimate punishment, and they got it. But while the crime was clear in its savagery, the process that followed would raise its own questions about justice, conscience, and consequences. Since his conviction, James Osgood has spent over a decade on Alabama's death row. Like many inmates, he's lived in solitary confinement, 24 hours a day in a cell the size of a bathroom. Legal appeals came and went. Each one was a shot at delaying the inevitable, and each one failed. But even as the clock ticked down, opposition grew, not just from activists, but even from jurors and lawmakers questioning the system's fairness. Now, the clock is ticking. The execution window opens at midnight on April 24th. James Osgood's name is etched onto the state's official schedule, and Alabama's execution team is preparing for a lethal injection that will end his life before dawn breaks. On execution day, Osgood will be offered a final meal of his choosing, a ritual both morbid and symbolic. He'll be given a chance to speak final words. In past executions, some inmates asked for forgiveness. Others stayed silent. But perhaps most emotional are the statements from the family of Tracy Brown. For them, this isn't just punishment, it's closure. Officials will then confirm his time of death. Another chapter closed, another life ended. As Alabama prepares for Osgood's execution, the public is divided. Proponents of capital punishment say justice demands a life for a life. But critics argue that the system is flawed, sometimes sentencing innocent people or allowing bias to seep in. A new bill in Alabama seeks to make it harder to impose the death penalty, requiring unanimous jury votes, something Osgood's case is now a symbol of. Among the witnesses to executions are not just officials, but sometimes those who sat on the jury. May Puckett, a juror in a 1994 death penalty case, now advocates for change after believing she helped convict an innocent man. Her emotional testimony before lawmakers reminds us that executions don't just affect the condemned, they echo into the lives of everyone involved. The story of James Osgood forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about crime, punishment, and the price of justice. As the state prepares to end one life in the name of another, we're left asking, are we closer to justice or trapped in a cycle we've yet to fully understand? This isn't just about a killer. It's about a system, a society, and the scars left behind.
Now at 10, the execution of Jamie Ray Mills is set for tomorrow evening at Holman Prison in Atmore.
This year, Governor Kay Ivey setting May 30th as the date to execute death row inmate Jamie Mills.
The state has executed Alabama death row inmate Jamie Ray Mills.
In May 2024, Alabama prepared to carry out one of the most controversial executions in recent years. Jamie Ray Mills, convicted of brutally murdering an elderly couple in 2004, would face lethal injection after nearly 2 decades on death row. But behind this sentence lies a haunting question. Was justice truly served, or did cracks in the system blur the line between guilt and due process? The crime that sealed Mills' fate began on a quiet summer day in 2004. Floyd and Vera Hill, an elderly couple living in Marion County, welcomed Mills and his wife into their home, not knowing that their kindness would lead to a gruesome end. What followed was a brutal assault involving a hammer, a tire iron, and a machete, tools of death used on people simply trying to help. Prosecutors argued the motive was robbery to fund a drug binge. Mills was convicted in 2007 and sentenced to death. His wife, Joanne, turned state's witness and received life with the possibility of parole.
Jamie Mills ambushed Floyd Hill in the shed, attacking him with a ball-peen hammer, a tire tool, and a machete.
For nearly 20 years, Jamie Mills lived in the shadow of his death sentence. During this time, questions emerged about the integrity of the prosecution. His legal team alleged misconduct, pointing to his wife's shifting testimony and undisclosed plea deals. In his final days, Mills pleaded for basic protections, like having his lawyer present during the execution and spending less time strapped to the gurney. But courts denied every appeal. The clock kept ticking.
The law firm representing Mills said in a statement after the execution that their client asked federal courts to provide some basic protections for him, including limiting the amount of time he had to spend on the execution
As May
gurney.
30th drew closer, protests mounted outside Holman Prison. Advocacy groups flooded the courts with petitions. Inside, Mills met with visitors and made final phone calls. Outside, the state prepared to make him the next person to die by lethal injection in Alabama, just months after it made headlines for using nitrogen gas in another execution. Jamie Mills spent his final morning quietly. He ate a meal of fried seafood, shrimp, catfish, oysters, and stuffed crab. At 6 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney. He looked at his family through the witness window, smiled, and gave them a thumbs up. His last words were filled with love. "I love my family. I love my brother. Carry on." At 6:14 p.m., a guard checked for consciousness. By 6:26 p.m., Mills was declared dead. The state's attorney general called the execution deserved, describing Mills' actions as cold and calculated.
I love my family. I love my brother. I love my sister. I couldn't ask for anything more. I love you all. Carry on.
But not everyone saw justice in Mills' death. The Equal Justice Initiative issued a scathing statement, condemning the process as unconstitutional and cruel. They criticized Alabama's unapologetic approach to executions, claiming the state tolerates misconduct and deprives inmates of fair treatment. For some, Mills' death was a necessary conclusion. For others, it was a glaring example of how the system fails the very ideals it claims to uphold.
Alabama's unapologetic state officials to once again start a process of killing a human being with uncertainty about what level of torture and cruelty will take.
The witnesses inside the chamber saw more than just a man die. Mills' loved ones sobbed as his breathing slowed, At 6:16 p.m., his chest stopped rising. But his death wasn't declared for another 10 minutes. He winked at his spiritual advisor, praying quietly before the drugs took full effect. His final moments were calm, but the trauma left in that room was anything but.
He appeared to take his final breath at 6:16 p.m., but was not declared dead until 6:26 p.m.
The story of Jamie Ray Mills forces us to look deeply into the moral weight of capital punishment. Justice may have been served for some, but the path there was filled with uncertainty, pain, and questions we may never fully answer. What we do with those questions and the lives behind them is a reflection of who we are as a society. Lisa Ann Coleman's story is not just about a crime or a punishment. It's about the tragic intersection of trauma, poverty, systemic failure, and justice. It's about a child who never got to grow up and a woman shaped by a broken world. We remember Devontae, we remember Lisa, and we ask, could this have been prevented?
Derrick Dearman, fueled by a toxic mix of drugs and rage, unleashed a horrific act of violence that would shock the entire state of Alabama. In the dead of night, Dearman crept onto the property, armed with an axe he found in the yard.
It happened in Citronelle. Dearman pleaded guilty to killing 6 people, including a pregnant woman at a home on Jim Platt Road. Dearman argued 4 of his convictions violated the double jeopardy principle.
A cocktail of drugs and fury turned a domestic dispute into a bloodbath. Dearman's rampage claimed the lives of 5, including an unborn child. The details of the crime scene were so horrific, they left seasoned investigators shaken. But even after pleading guilty to this unspeakable act, the legal process dragged on, leaving the victims' families in agonizing limbo. Would justice ever truly be delivered? Years passed. Dearman sat on death row, a stark reminder of the brutality inflicted. The families of the victims endured an unimaginable weight, their grief compounded by the slow grind of the appeals process. Did Dearman show any remorse? Did he fight his sentence? The question of when or if justice would finally arrive hung heavy in the air.
As far as our information, there was a lot of staff interacting with him. He had visited with his families. We have no indication that he ingested controlled substances today.
The legal battles dwindled. The final appeals were exhausted. The machinery of justice, slow but relentless, was grinding towards its conclusion. An execution date was set. The end was in sight. What were Dearman's final thoughts? What were the last wishes of a man facing his ultimate reckoning? October 17th, 2024. The appointed day. The final hours ticked away for Derrick Dearman. Did he request a last meal? What were the words he uttered in his final moments? And what raw emotions poured forth from the families whose lives he had shattered? The world waited to witness the culmination of years of pain and the final act of justice.
Be a warning to all of you. If you ain't serving the Lord, you serve that devil. This is what you get for evil in your life.
The execution was carried out. Derrick Dearman was gone. But what lingered in the aftermath? Did the public feel a sense of closure? Did this act serve as a deterrent? The debate surrounding capital punishment raged on, fueled by this horrific case and the ultimate price paid. This case forces us to confront difficult questions about the death penalty. Is it a just punishment for heinous crimes, or a cruel and unusual practice that has no place in modern society? For those who witnessed the execution, the experience was undoubtedly profound. What did they see? What emotions filled the room as Dearman's life came to an end? Their accounts offer a chilling glimpse into the finality of capital punishment.
Yeah, that's right, Eugene Cameron. I was one of the media representatives chosen for that duty. Dearman apologized one last time for his crimes. Then he told his own family that he loved him, and then he was gone.
For his last words, Dearman was pronounced deceased at 6:14 p.m.
The Derrick Dearman case is a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked rage and the destructive power of drugs. While his execution brings a legal end to this horrific chapter, the scars left on the victims' families and the community will undoubtedly endure. This tragedy forces us to confront difficult questions about justice, forgiveness, and our society's response to such profound evil. May the memory of those lost serve as a call for greater understanding and prevention of such senseless violence. A man sentenced to die, a method rarely used, and a justice system tested under public scrutiny. Alan Eugene Miller's story is more than a crime. It's a clash of law, ethics, and human rights. What happens when a state tries something almost no one else has?
Alan Eugene Miller was convicted in the workplace shooting rampage that killed 3 people in 1999. This will be the second attempt to carry out Miller's execution. The Alabama Department of Corrections attempted to put Miller to death 2 years ago.
For the second time in the nation's history, nitrogen gas has been used to execute an inmate. The state of Alabama put to death convicted murderer Alan Eugene Miller on Thursday night. It is the second time this year the state has employed the controversial method.
On August 5th, 1999, Alan Miller snapped. Armed and deliberate, he executed 3 former co-workers in a calculated spree of violence across Pelham, Alabama. The shootings, allegedly triggered by delusional beliefs that colleagues were spreading rumors about him, shocked a community and sealed his fate. Within minutes, the police had him in custody. Within months, a jury would decide he should die.
Miller killed Lee Holdbrooks and Scott Yancey at one business, then drove to another location and shot Terry Jarvis.
Miller spent over 2 decades on death row, but his case took an unusual turn in 2022 when his execution by lethal injection failed. His legal team argued he had chosen nitrogen hypoxia as his method, but the state claimed his paperwork was lost. The battle that followed questioned whether the state had the right to kill someone using a method they hadn't properly prepared for. Despite the controversy, Alabama pressed forward. With federal appeals exhausted and courts permitting the execution, a date was set: September 26, 2024. The state prepared for only the second nitrogen hypoxia execution in American history. Despite the controversy, Alabama pressed forward. With federal appeals exhausted and courts permitting the execution, a date was set: September 26, 2024. The state prepared for only the second nitrogen hypoxia execution in American history. The world watched Alabama's experiment. Human rights groups condemned the method. Some argued nitrogen hypoxia was untested and torturous. Yet Attorney General Steve Marshall called it humane and effective. A battle between justice and morality reignited, and the world debated. Was this punishment or cruelty disguised as science?
That should be answered about this method before it is used again.
Witnesses in the execution chamber described a disturbing scene: shaking, gasping, silence. Valerie Bell, a media observer, recalled Miller's body tensing and pulling against the restraints for minutes. The state insisted this was expected. Others saw suffering, The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between gasps and silence.
Ty Miller could be seen visibly shaking, trembling, and pulling at his restraints for the first 2 minutes.
The execution of Alan Eugene Miller closes one chapter, but opens many others. It leaves behind 3 victims, 1 man executed, and a country still unsure of how justice should look or feel. In the end, it forces us to ask, does a new method of death bring closure, or only a new way to question what justice really means? In the annals of American criminal justice, few cases ignite debate as fiercely as that of John Lewis Evans. A brutal crime, a defiant criminal, and an execution marred by controversy. This is a story that forces us to confront the very meaning of justice. What happens when a life spirals into violence, culminating in a punishment as absolute as death?
About 15 demonstrators protesting the death penalty spent most of the night outside the prison burning candles, singing, and praying. Most of them feared that if John Evans died in the electric chair, it would open the floodgates for more executions.
For a time, it seemed the execution might be stayed, the legal system wrestling with its conscience. But the wheels of justice, however contentious, continued to turn. But who was the man at the center of this storm? What path led John Louis Evans to a crime so heinous it demanded the ultimate price? John Evans' life was a descent to darkness. From petty theft, a chilling partnership with Wayne Ritter emerged, unleashing a wave of terror across 7 states. Over 30 armed robberies, 9 kidnappings, a spree that culminated in a single brutal act that sealed his fate. The robbery of a mobile pawn shop in 1977 ended with the senseless murder of Edward Nasser, a crime witnessed by his 2 young daughters. This act of violence, devoid of remorse, ignited public fury and set Evans firmly on a path towards death row.
They entered the shop thinking Nasser's shop was easy target. Ritter asked Edward Nasser to show him the gun. When Nasser handed him the gun, Evans pulled his gun and declared this was a robbery. Nasser attempted to crawl away, but Evans shot him in the back, killing him.
Stripped of freedom, confined to the stark reality of death row, John Evans awaited his fate. Did the weight of his actions finally sink in? Were there last-ditch attempts at redemption, or simply a hardening against the inevitable? The legal battles continued, spearheaded by his mother, fighting for any sliver of hope. But within the condemned man, a different kind of struggle may have been unfolding. In a surprising move, Evans himself would eventually choose to halt further appeals, a decision that spoke volumes about his state of mind in those final days. The legal avenues exhausted, the date was set, April 22, 1983. The final 24 hours began to tick away for John Louis Evans. The world outside the prison walls held its breath, a morbid anticipation hanging in the air. Inside, the stark reality of imminent death began to crystallize. The last meal, a final phone call, the rituals of death row played out with grim precision. What were Evans' last words? Did the victim's family offer any statement as the execution drew near? And what pronouncements came from the officials tasked with carrying out this irreversible act? The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation with mortality. The switch was flipped, but the story didn't end there. The execution of John Lewis Evans ignited a firestorm of debate. Was justice truly served? Or did the botched procedure raise fundamental questions about the very nature of capital punishment? Public opinion remained sharply divided, the consequences of this execution echoing far beyond the prison walls. The scars of the crime, the controversy surrounding the execution, The case left an indelible mark on the American psyche. The story of John Louis Evans is not just about a single crime and a single execution. It's a stark reminder of the complexities of justice, the devastating consequences of violence, and the enduring debate over society's right to take a life. In reflecting on this case, we are compelled to ask ourselves, what does it truly mean to achieve justice, and at what cost? The echoes of John Louis Evans' reckoning continue to resonate, challenging our understanding of crime, punishment, and the very essence of our humanity.